Well, it's clear here, but I didn't pay attention to what it says.
So, 5 years we're in.
A little time.
That's what it was last time there. Last 3 years. And his family for a late Thanksgiving. It was foggy from about, well, going over, it was foggy from about Central Point through Grants Pass, and on the way back, it was still foggy there, and then also a little bit foggy everywhere else.
Tell Carolyn it's a bright, sunshiny day here in Ashland.
It is nice and clear and sunshiny.
She was afraid it was gonna be too foggy and icy.
No ice to speak of. Some frost on the ground, but thankfully it's been dry long enough that there's no major hazards at this point. I did get a text this morning from Bethel. She's not been feeling well for the last few weeks. So, of course, I think the one weekend we had that bomb cyclone or whatever they called it. I'm sure that probably would have made it difficult for her to get over the pass. But for the most part, she's actually just been fighting a bug and some other things. So she's asked for prayers, but it does feel that she's moving in the right direction. Are there any other announcements or prayer requests?
Stay away from me.
Okay, we need to, from the sounds and looks of everything, we all need to practice social distancing. So no holy kisses.
You know, I picked up Rebecca this morning at the airport. She flew in from Utah and she's at the house in bed. Yeah. She's not feeling well at all either. And she had to get a couple things within the RV with her. Yeah, she's not feeling well at all.
It's that time of year.
Yeah.
No, people get together and say,
We're
eat all food.
we're all cooped up in buildings together, and our systems are going through some shock between time change and temperature changes, and that opens us up to a lot of things.
So, Thomas, are you up to a scene tonight?
Yeah. No, sure is. He will never say no. Just tell you that. He'll never say no.
All right, in case anybody didn't hear, we are going to do singing tonight for worship. All right, well, let's go ahead and begin with a word of prayer. Our Lord and Father, we are grateful and thankful for this day that you have given to us. We are thankful for the ability to be here, and we understand that many of our number are not feeling 100%, and we ask that you will be a comfort to them, and that hopefully their symptoms are minor and recovery is swift. We ask, Lord, that you'll be with those who are not with us for whatever reason, some for health and others for distance and things. We ask that you would, again, be a blessing to them, and that we can enjoy a fuller fellowship. Please, Lord, continue to be with this congregation and what we try to do, both as a united family and as individuals for the glory of you and your kingdom. Help us, Father, to always let your light shine as we study this morning on how to be a better part of the body. Help us, Father, to take these things to heart, that we can live out these things and be what you would have us to be. Christ, name we pray. All right, so we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 once again this morning. We're going to theoretically finish the look at Paul's treatment of the metaphor of the body of Christ here, and then we will shift to Romans 12 and kind of compare and contrast, and we'll look at some other places, probably not this week, but we'll look at some other places where the body, where the idea of the body is used, but maybe not in the fullness that it is in these two chapters of 1 Corinthians and Romans. And so last week, by way of review reminder, we looked at the first part of 1 Corinthians 12 where Paul discusses the idea that there are different gifts of the Spirit, but it's one body, and kind of in the same way that we wouldn't want a body that was all hands, we can't say that any part is lesser. He takes it I do find it interesting that if you look at especially verses 14 and following, Paul's description of it here is less about looking at others and saying they don't have a place as much as looking at ourselves and saying I don't have a place. And I think that's very telling. I think this is telling of human nature going all the way back to the first century. That here were brothers and sisters in the Corinthian church who may not have had certain gifts, and so they were therefore saying, I must not be as important, I must not be as good a Christian, I must not be as loved of God as this brother or sister over here. Now, the Corinthian church had a lot of division issues, and so I'm not going to dismiss the fact that the possibility that maybe there were some looking down their nose at others, and in fact, Paul does seem to reference that, especially in chapter 14. But I do think it's interesting that here he is at least starting this discussion by saying, don't discount your value to the church. And I think by and large, I mean, I can speak from personal experience, and I know that's been one of my problems, especially when I was younger. A newer, not only younger age-wise, but a newer Christian, and I didn't feel that I had a lot of knowledge, and I didn't feel like I had a whole lot to offer, but the point is that regardless of how much knowledge we have or don't have or perceive, and I would challenge us that we probably have more knowledge and more skills than we realize. I mean, just think about if you were to create for yourself a spiritual resume, right? I don't know about you, but I always struggle with creating a resume. I've had to do it an unfortunate amount of times over the last 5 or 6 years. But I always struggle with it because I always try to, well, what skills do I have? Like I know what I did for a job, but how do I put that in a way that doesn't sound so specific to what I did for that one place, that one time, right? Well, the same thing applies. Things that we do in our personal lives and our professional lives also give us skills and abilities that can transfer over to help the church, right? And at the same time, I don't believe that we pick up the Bible by osmosis. I don't think you could put the Bible under your pillow at night and wake up with it, and it's Bible knowledge. But I think that we pick things up, and I think that we make connections more than we sometimes give ourselves credit for. And at the same time, the only way to know is to challenge ourselves to use it. And if we have a deficiency, we have a deficiency, right? If we have a weakness, right? I mean, how do I know that I can't bench press 400 pounds unless I try, right? I mean, I have a pretty good idea that that's not a thing, but I don't know. I've never tried, right? So again, you never know. And I had a personal trainer one time after I broke my arm that basically told me the same thing. He said, you'll probably surprise yourself at how strong you really are. So start with something you feel is safe, but don't be afraid to push yourself. Was kind of his mentality, and I would offer that same advice to Christians. Even then, amassing knowledge doesn't move away from knowledge and into wisdom or any of those things unless we push ourselves a little bit, put it to use.
So, follow up on that just a little bit.
Yeah.
It's a good one. That growth and development is sometimes working with others to see how that might work. And I'll use door knocking personal work as an example. When I lived down in California, and there was a group of young adults, and they were wanting to do personal work, but they'd never really done it much before other than themselves, and they started, they admitted that they were pretty, they used the word silly about it. They would giggle as they would go along, you go, that kind of stuff. Well, some of us who had done some before and had a little bit more experience went with them, And then the end of it gets said, oh, I understand now a little bit better how to do that, approach it in a little bit more serious way, calm way, a little bit of method to it, whatever. And that's true for all of us in any kind of task that we're doing. So it's a good one to not curb ourselves and say, I can't do that, or I won't do that, but see if we can work our way up to do it.
Absolutely. For those online that may not have been able to hear Steve, he mentioned working with some young people during a door knocking, and how they admitted that they didn't have a lot of experience, maybe were acting a little bit out of character, to use their own term, a little silly, and went out with some more experienced Christians and kind of saw firsthand maybe some better ways of approaching the situation and tactics to use, and again, made some improvements that were very valuable. And yeah, I think that's a great example. Another thing just to note real quick is you probably can't do it the way somebody else does. So if you've seen the way, for example, I'll use myself as an example, I can't preach like Greg. We have totally different styles of approaching a lot of different things, including even our study. And I studied with Greg extensively. But if I try to copy Greg, it's not going to work. If I try to copy any of my teachers from School of Preaching, it's not going to work because I'm not them. I don't have their background. I don't have their, whatever. So I can't parrot them and be true to what God is asking of me as a Christian. Now, again, as Steve's example, sometimes we can learn from the example of how somebody else does it, but chances are you're going to have to modify it for you, and that's okay. I think we sometimes kind of fault ourselves. Well, I see how they do it and they're so effective, I can't do it that way. And we immediately go, obviously that's not my, it's like, well, maybe you do it a different way. Teaching, maybe standing in front of a group of people, never going to be your thing. But maybe you can sit down with a small group or one-on-one. You're still teaching. It's okay to do it a little bit different. And so I would say, again, and I think that's kind of in the spirit of what Paul is talking about here, of not discounting what I have and my abilities because they're not exactly the same as somebody else's. And that's a dangerous thing to do when we talk a little bit about that, comparing to one another. Okay, but let's pick up here in the text. 1 Corinthians 12, if somebody could read verses 22 through the end of the chapter.
On the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. And the parts we think are less honorable, we treat with special honor. And the parts that are unpresentable are treated with special modesty. While our presentable parts need no special treatment. But God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. If one part suffers, every part suffers with it. If one part is honored, every part rejoices with it. Now you are the body of Christ, and each one of you is a part of it. And God has placed in the church, first of all, apostles, second, prophets, third, teachers, then miracles, then gifts of healing, of helping, of guidance, and of different kinds of tongues. Are all apostles? Are all prophets? Are all teachers? Do all work miracles? Do all have gifts of healing? Do all speak in tongues? Do all interpret? Now eagerly desire the greater gifts. And yet, I will show you the most excellent way.
Thank you. All right, so here, again, Paul is, we see here in this, he kind of departs a little bit from the metaphor a little bit more, and again, kind of uses it as the springboard to talk about actual personal relationships in the real world. Because obviously, you know, our physical bodies, yes, we suffer when one part is not working, but there's not as much of the rejoicing, right? I don't see, you know, when my arm healed, it's not like my legs were like, so he's there, we see a shift away from, you know, really pressing the metaphor and really talking more about the relationship that the metaphor is supposed to be describing. But again, he talks here about, you know, the honorable versus dishonorable. And he's not talking about the fact that there's anything dishonorable about serving Christ. And he's not talking about it as though there are members of the church that need to just stay in the shadows. That's not what he means. What he means is that there's always those parts. I mean, how many, and I talked about this before, how often do we think about, well, I wonder if my kidneys are working? I wonder how they're doing right now. Right? There's just parts of our body that there's that autonomic. We don't even think about it. Even breathing is semi-autonomic. Yes, we can stop breathing, we can hold our breath, things like that. But by and large, we don't even have to walk around all day thinking, yeah, I'm breathing. Right? And in fact, we don't even know that there is a problem until something doesn't feel right, something's not, or we go to the doctor and they tell us, hey, this level doesn't look right on your blood work or something. Right? We don't even realize sometimes that there is a problem. Sometimes it's, you know, what they call asymptomatic. So what he's talking about here is kind of in that same thought process of parts of our body that we don't really think about. There are people, and in every congregation I've seen this to be true, and I think it becomes especially true when one of those people passes away or has to move away. And you go, oh, great, who's going to take care of this list of things that we didn't ever think about because Tom always just did it? Right? And Paul's point is, does that long list of things need to get done? Yeah, because now we have to think about it, right? So there are just sometimes those things that happen in the church or that people do in the church that don't get the fanfare, that don't get the, you know, the notice, but it doesn't make them less important. It doesn't make them less of a Christian or anything of that nature. And in fact, Paul's emphasis here is that we need to show abundant honor. We need to take more notice of that. And I think this is kind of a double-edged sword thing, I think, for a lot of Christians, that we shouldn't do things for the praise. But who here has ever stayed with something where they feel thankless and abused?
Probably everybody.
Okay, but who stays in those situations long term? Who's like, yes, this is exactly what I wanted. I wanted another job where I'm just taken advantage of. Nobody ever sees that I contribute, right? Who wants to do that for the rest of their life? Nobody. I would say that I would argue that that's probably one of the big reasons that a lot of people change jobs. Obviously, there's other reasons, but you know, even when it comes down to monetary reasons for changing. Why do people leave one job for a better paying job? Well, because the better pay shows that the other employer maybe appreciates your skills and abilities more, right? Well, same thing goes for Christians. We shouldn't be doing it for the praise, and according to Jesus himself, right, when we do good deeds, it should be so that our Father in heaven is glorified. But if we never acknowledge that somebody is doing a laundry list of things in the church, if we never acknowledge that, even if it's just privately, they're not gonna stick around. I'm not gonna tell you they're gonna leave the church, but they may leave that congregation. And in extreme cases, maybe they will leave the church. And so, Paul's emphasis here is not about seeking, it's not about me, it's about appreciating my brothers, sisters, and expressing, right? As he says, even on those which we deem less honorable, and in there we see as less honorable, that is, we don't maybe see them standing up in front of the congregation a lot. They don't get, just to give you an idea, if somebody searches our YouTube, if somebody searches our Facebook page, they're gonna see a handful of faces all the time, right? But there's a whole lot more people in this congregation that are doing things and definitely necessary, right? But again, from the outside, what do they see? And even when they come and visit, granted, they're gonna see all of the faces, but how many people on a Sunday morning or even a Wednesday stand up in front and actually do something? Big quotes on that. Okay. And so again, we need to, be aware of that. And I personally try to, I have rarely preached on a Sunday that somebody doesn't say, hey, thank you. All right. But I also try to make sure that I say thank you on a regular basis to people that are doing things. I try to be aware of it. Again, because I don't have this opportunity. I can't live up the gospel as Paul puts it, if nobody is willing to support my work. He says, and there's also the invisible people on Zoom. Yeah, that's, by the way, all of our Zoomers, if you will, that's your choice. I have no problem if you want to turn your cameras on. If you want to leave them off because it's still kind of early in the morning, that is entirely fine. But if you don't want to be invisible, you don't have to. But again, I think it's very important for us to, as Paul says here, to bestow honor where honor is due. Right? Again, it's not about puffing up the ego. It's just acknowledging, hey, you're doing something that if nothing else, I don't have to do. Thank you for that.
Well, yeah, so verse 14 through 19 are the self-image correction of don't think lesser of yourself, and then 20, and kind of to the point where we're talking is don't think less of others. He's correcting both sides of that. And with the quote unquote invisible people, you were talking about somebody coming into the congregation, they're going to see the men leading in service, and they're going to see us sitting in the pews, maybe, the people up on the screen in Zoom. But how we all know that, I'll say the wives here and the women here are doing work, but we don't know the work that's going on in the private homes of those families either. The wives supporting the men that are leading, the women doing Bible studies with other women. You don't see that on the surface, but if we don't appreciate that and encourage it, it's going to cause burnout, and people are going to maybe not leave, but they might just lay that task down.
Sure.
And we don't want that.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know very many successful Christian men, and again, I can use myself really only as the example, but I'll say especially successful preachers, and define successful however you choose, but very few of them are going to do that without a good, strong woman behind. I'm not saying the preacher has to be married, but as one brother put it in School of Preaching, he has unfortunately seen men whose wives do keep them. from being the preacher they probably could. And so, again, and generally speaking, of course, the wives do, like I said, a lot more behind the scenes that we don't see, like she said, whether it's Bible studies with other women, raising children in the home, all of those things that those tasks, not exclusively, but often majoritively fall to the ladies. Again, those things can go unsung around here. That's Paul, and then like she's as Linda pointed out, the first part, verses 14 through 21, is dealing with my view of myself, and then these verses that we just looked at are from my view of my brothers and sisters. And again, we see in verse 25 that he goes back to this idea that there should be no division, but we have the same care one for another. And again, it's about support, it's about that love. And Paul, and in verse 26, this idea of suffering and honoring, this is a theme that he does mention in other places, right? Now, the book of Galatians, bear one another's burdens, rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. Right? This is a very common theme throughout the New Testament because it's something that we need. And then verse 27 and following, he kind of brings it home, or as one brother put it, kind of brings it to the front porch. And it really kind of applies to both sides. Okay? When you look at this list of works in the church, and some of these are spiritual gifts, of course, but when you look at what these things represent, it's looking at it of, okay, well, I may not be an apostle. I may not have this, that, or the other, but that doesn't mean that I don't have a place. But it's also looking from it on the other side of, well, I can't expect everybody to be an apostle. I can't expect everybody to have every single gift. Right? That's not how it works. That's not how life works. Right? And so, when he looks at this, he says that there's these people that have been appointed or chosen or given the authority or power as apostles and prophets and teachers, miracles, and healings, guidance, or some translations say administrations. And that's exactly what it sounds like. Right? Even Jesus and the 12 had administrators, so to speak. Who? Did they all have their own, for example? No, it was pulled together, and Judas was the administrator of the money. And again, some people are blessed with a mind for those types of things. They're blessed with a mind that can plan and organize and put into practice. Great, we need that. 100%, right?
Some people need Bill.
Some people need Bill, absolutely. Yeah, and again, we don't have a lot of information about what went on behind the scenes with the 12, right? But in those situations, Bill says, "Oh shucks." In those situations, though, where you have to have some of that administrative. If that's their blessing, if that's their gift, if that's where their talent lies, God doesn't discount them because they never preach a sermon, because they never cast out a demon or healed the sick, or right. I imagine that just for example, Matthew Levi probably pretty good with money and numbers as well, right? I mean, he was a tax collector. So why didn't Judas give it back? We don't know. But again, there was a choice made there, right? And so, we have to acknowledge those things, both in ourselves and in others, that I might have, well, we use it, Chinese menu, right? Get one from column A, one from column B, and one from column C, right? Maybe all my strengths come from some column C, or somebody else, maybe they're spread out a little bit, or maybe I just get one from column B. Okay, you're still on the menu, right?
So, may I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Um, It's interesting that Paul here, in using the example, uses the physical example of the body. And then you're rightly pointing out that there were examples from the work of the apostles themselves. And then obviously in early in Acts, it said the apostles were overwhelmed with the work. So then they appointed the deacons to do work. But the thing about it, there probably weren't too many examples within the society of organizations that they could use as an example of a functioning unit, saying we all work together as a team. The military is one that's used at times. Family is one that's used at times. But it's interesting that he uses the body here as a physical example and not a social, human example of organization. But he does use elsewhere the family at the time, right?
Yeah, he does use the family. He does use the idea of the family. And you're right. There are more limited metaphors. Paul, for example, uses sports metaphors quite a bit. Often it's more of what we would consider solo things like running a race. But he does use the military, for example, in talking to Timothy. He says that no soldier, once they've taken their commission, can concern themselves about what's going on back home. They have to be devoted to their task. But it's also the same thing he uses farming. But by and large, yeah, this idea of using the body is definitely the largest contextual metaphor that's used in the New Testament. And I think it comes down to a couple of things. Number one, everybody understands what it's like to have a body. Whatever your range of function, we all understand what it's like to have a body. And we understand what it's like when parts of that body don't function as. But number two, especially when you look at some of those physical things, like the army, like the military, or other social things, they have major problems, right? And not problems that we just, everything has problems, but when you look at historically the Roman army, yes, it was effective in doing what it needed to do when it came from a conquest standpoint, but when you consider that a lot of those people were conscripted because they were slaves or debtors or prisoners of war, not exactly, the shining example that Christians are supposed to be, right? And I would say that of all simple things, and that's the problem when the church tries to overly lean on those types of examples, right? Well, for example, the Roman Catholic Church tried to model itself instead of after God's pattern, after the Roman government, with the Pope being equal to Caesar, etc. But that's not what God wanted. And so again, this is, I think, why we have some of these descriptors that are either very generic, like, farmer's got to put his hand to a plow. Okay, obviously, right? But that's as far as he wants to carry the farming metaphor, right? Or, seed's going to grow how it wants to grow. Cool, but that's as far as we're going to take the farming. Whereas we can dive much deeper into a discussion of the body and these different pieces and parts and roles and responsibilities because it's much more easily understood, but also it helps to not set up a potentially damaging way of looking at things. Because if we organize the church like the body with interconnected yet also autonomous workings, well, that's exactly what the church is supposed to be, right? Both at a congregational level, but then also at the universal level, so to speak, right? Because each congregation operates independently, just like your lungs technically operate independently from your liver, right? But at the same time, we need one another, right? When we travel, when we visit or what have you, or sometimes there's just those things where maybe it's not something that we can do on our own, and so we reach out to a brother or sister congregation. Hey, let's make something happen together. Right? Whether that's maybe you want to bring in a speaker and have a lectureship, but it's too much for any one congregation to handle all the cost of it. Or from a biblical example, maybe there's a problem in a region, like there was in Judea during Paul's second, third missionary journeys. So he was collecting money from other churches to help feed the brethren in that famine and stricken area. The same thing goes for fire relief, flood relief, all of those types of things that we see the churches getting into, but it's not all one church just all of a sudden, oh, we had $3 million in the bank we forgot about. Guess we can help people now. Right? That's not not how it works. But again, I think this metaphor of the body works both at the congregational and at the larger level, because it's how God wants the church to work.
It's interesting. We have the body, but we also have the head.
Mhm.
Christ is the head. He's what works all the body. So that it's connected.
Well, yeah, and like I said, they're semi-independent, but they're also very interconnected, right? None of your body, none of your organs are going to continue to function if your lungs or your heart stop working. And realistically, if your liver, your kidneys, even your spleen stops working, it's going to cause some major problems and possibly cause other things to fail. And again, that's the same thing for the church. That individually we each have our own things that we're doing, but at the same time we have to be interconnected, doing everything on our own. I thought somebody was. As an example, we lost Betty M recently, and those who never used her as a public, I know we never used her as a public speaker. We are still healing from her loss. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I'll just say, I don't think we often give enough credit to those that are just a stalwart example. As we age, maybe physically we can't do everything that we once did or want to do still. But again, we can be an example.
Definite encouragement.
Yes, absolutely. But again, I don't think we often, and I think that one mainly falls into the view of self side of it. Because in my conversations with a lot of people who reach, a point in their lives, they feel like they're less of a Christian because they can't do all the things they used to do. And it's like, I'm only 40 and I can't do all the things I used to do. So it's okay. It's okay. But there are other things that we can do that you couldn't. There are things that a 70-year-old can do for encouragement, for example, say that a 20-year-old has no business even trying, right?
Well, and sometimes we don't know the effect of our encouragement and our just being there for people. I'm thinking of my grandma was a Bible class teacher, and for, I'll say like most of her childhood, there was a little boy that used to go to her Bible class, and that little boy grew up attributing his faithfulness to her Bible classes and became an elder in the church. He's since gone on to his reward, but he would still go and visit my grandparents while living in California. And we ended up going to a congregation where he had been the elder. You never know the impact of being there, being that person that gave a hug on Sunday morning, even when the child wasn't even your child in Bible class anymore. They grew out to a different grade level or whatever. Those quiet people that just are there for your, that you see them there constantly, like Betty. She did a lot of work when she was younger. And I know, like, my grandma's like, well, I don't do what I used to do, like you're saying, but just being there and being that encouragement, that smile, that hug, that handshake is what a lot of people just need in their lives.
And for those online who may not have heard Linda, she used an example of Phyllis, her grandmother, being a Bible class teacher and a young man who was in her classes and grew up having a lot of regard for her. He grew up, eventually became an elder of the church and would often visit her just because he remembered her as his Bible class teacher and attributed a lot of who he was as a man and a Christian to her example of a Bible class teacher. And one of those odd coincidences in the world, one of the congregations I worked at in California was a congregation that he had been previously an elder at, stepped down because of health. But, absolutely. And there's also something just, again, to the example of finishing the race. Continuing in faithfulness might be your, because again, we need that, right? We need those people that, well, they were there for me when I was a kid, but then I heard that they fell away. Well, that can mess with your perception, right? And so, how much more powerful is it? Oh, wow, this person was such an example to me, and they, I've heard that their life got hard, and they really dealing with some health problems, but man, are they still faithful? That in itself is huge in the minds of a lot of people. And again, I think that's, as we're talking about people like Betty and others, I don't think we often struggle as much with ourselves perceiving them well. But maybe we need to say something so that so we make sure that they perceive themselves properly. And again, I wouldn't say it's universal, but I've had that discussion with a lot of leaders. Maybe it's by virtue of the fact that most of the congregations that we've worked with have been much greater than they were any other color. But again, it's something that I've seen a lot of people, and some people that I have found very surprising at times. Even former preachers, who because of the age and health didn't feel like they were doing enough. And again, I think that's something that, as Paul's talking about, that support of one another is important. And he says here at the end, desire greater things, and he's going to show them a more excellent way. And for the sake of time, I'm going to look at the greater way here in 1 Corinthians, but to not give away the ending, I guess, too much. But if you look at chapter 14, he's talking about preaching the word being the greatest gift that we can ask for. And he's gonna use specifically the example of worship, but he's not meaning that obviously teaching or preaching of the word of God has to be something that's done exclusively or only in a worship type assembly, but that's the more excellent way, because well, not everybody can fill all of these roles, right? Some of these roles that he describes here have gone away, right? But there's always, 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 as long as the sun is shining and this earth is still spinning, always going to be a need for somebody to step forward and tell somebody else about the word. Again, whatever capacity that is in your life, that's fine. Okay, we are out of time for this morning, so we're going to pause here, but Lord willing, next week we will come together and we will look at Romans chapter 12. Very companion passage to this one, also a deep treatment of this idea of the body. But we're going to see in Romans 12 that Paul approaches it not necessarily from the side of unity, as he does in 1 Corinthians, but here in Romans 12, it's more about service. So, all right, thank you very much, and we will pause for a moment to get ready for our worship.